Welcome to another edition of Against the Current, coming to you from the Skyline Club atop the Old Republic Building in downtown Chicago. I'm Dan Proft, Morning Drive co-host of AM 560, Chicago's Morning Answer, 5 to 9 a.m. Monday through Friday. A little plug there. And pleased to be joined on this installment by State Senator Dan McConchie, a freshman Republican from Hawthorne Woods in scenic Lake County. Dan, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on, Dan.
So we're in the second week of June, and we have budget impasse, as the Democrats in Illinois are fond to say. 700 days without a balanced state budget. It's been more like 30 years without a constitutionally balanced state budget, which is the constitutionally balanced is the descriptor that the Democrats like to strip out of this conversation. But nonetheless, Illinois just downgraded to a state with the worst credit rating of any state in the history of America. That's quite an achievement. And I wonder what you would say to your constituents and, frankly, Illinois families across the state about why that is, why Illinois finds itself with that worst credit rating in the history of America, and why we find ourselves with $14 billion in unpaid bills and increasing, and all of the other doom and gloom scenarios that have been predicted because we don't have a state budget.
Well, you know, at core, what we've had, I mean, you've mentioned the fact that we've had nearly 30 years of unbalanced budgets in some way, shape, or form. But at core of that really does sit Speaker Madigan. He has, it was interesting because at the end of session, the Senate passed a budget. I did not support the budget because it raised taxes on hardworking families by $5.4 billion.
A 32% increase in the personal income tax, an increase in the corporate tax, an increase in the state sales tax.
Expanded what it was to its select services. It added a satellite tax, a Netflix tax, raised your cable tax. But in all of that, so I didn't support that. But the Senate did pass a budget and send it over to the House. And for the first time in memory, Speaker Madigan didn't even call a budget for a vote. He simply adjourned. He went home without even passing a budget out of the House. I don't know of anyone in memory that's ever recalled him doing that. And so if someone wants to talk about abrogating responsibility, he has a majority, up until midnight on the 31st of May. He could have taken his majority and passed whatever budget he wanted to do, whatever he could do to get 60 votes and send that over to the Senate. That's what he actually did last year. He took a budget and passed it, which was $7 billion out of balance, sent it over to the Senate. The Senate rejected it because of how out of balance it was. And then we went for the last year without a regular budget. But this year, he didn't even put a vote up at all, which I found to be rather shocking and I think a mistake at the end of the day.
It's interesting, the parallels, right? House Speaker Mike Madigan is the longest serving state House Speaker in the history of America, and Illinois has the lowest credit rating of any state in the history of America. Are those two things related, perhaps?
Well, I think they are. I mean, certainly. It's interesting because when you're working with others down in Springfield, you get to know people both on your side of the aisle as well as those on the other side of the aisle. And in quiet conversations with Democrats, they said, look, the speaker's made it clear that there's two constituencies that he will not upset. One is trial lawyers, and the others are the unions. And so whatever it is that they want, he is going to ensure that they get. And at the end of the day, it's not, I think recently Speaker Madigan actually did a half an hour long interview with WGN Radio.
Oh yeah, it's very illuminating.
But it was interesting, at the end of that interview, the host asked him, what is your legacy? And he said, well, my legacy is my family. I have a great wife, I have 4 kids, we have grandchildren. That's my legacy. And then he was asked the question, well, so what's the legacy for the people of Illinois? And he just went on an attack against Bruce Rauner. He could not offer any sort of defense to say how he had made the state better for the last 30 plus years that he's been speaker. And I think it's because he doesn't have an answer, frankly.
Well, right. I mean, the Illinois, by any quality of life metric and by everyone's opinion, is the worst governed state in the nation, with all of the number ones for worst. Largest unfunded pension liabilities, worst credit rating, largest outmigration. It just goes on and on. Largest overall state and local tax burden. And speaking of the budget and a constitutionally balanced state budget for the first time in just darn near my lifetime. It's interesting to me. Again, trying to connect dots for people. So we have the largest state and local tax burden, and we're the worst governed state in the nation. We have the largest unfunded liabilities, the most per capita in terms of unpaid bills, the largest property taxes. Are those two things related, right? The spend side versus the delivery of service, fiscal stability side?
Well, certainly, and that's because, again, the primary interest that the leadership in this state has had for far too long, and frankly from both parties, if you want to go back and look at previous governors, it was taking care of the patronage jobs. So you had George Ryan, when he was Secretary of State, had one of the largest patronage operations in the state, continued that as governor. He did us no favors in regards to helping put the state on a path toward fiscal responsibility. And then you have, the speaker, you have President Cullerton, who's been in office for, he's been in office for nearly as long.
4 decades, yeah.
And, as well, it was interesting to kind of watch over the past year because historically the Senate has really been seen as kind of the lapdog of the speaker. And it is, one of the kudos I will give President Cullerton is the fact that he has said, I'm tired of being a lapdog, right? I am tired of essentially...
It's a great recognition on his part that he's been a lapdog for these many years. By the way, isn't he the godfather to Madigan, one or more of Madigan's children?
I believe so, yeah.
Mm.
But at the end of the day, they did start to do some acting on their own. Unfortunately, it was even farther, in my opinion, in the wrong direction. I mean, we saw very little in the form of spending restraint when the whole grand bargain was being negotiated. This started from the wrong place. The grand bargain started from a position of, okay, let's assume we could raise the income tax back to the level that it was before, or nearly that. So before it was. It had been raised from 3% to 5%, then it went back down to 3.75. Then they said, okay, well, let's get to 4.99. Let's 4.95. Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Very cagey.
And so, but during all of that, they ended up raising the tax burden by an additional $5.4 billion in areas kind of across the board. And it was interesting. I actually had one Democrat tell me that, well, this tax increase actually will benefit the state and the people in the state because it provides certainty at the end of the day. For them and for many of them, at the end of the day, certainty, whether it's bad certainty, is somehow better than not being sure what the tax rate will be next year.
Well, sure. I mean, there's certainty in authoritarian or dictatorial regimes, too. There's certainty, but it's not great certainty. So this is the whole point. It's like, let's just get something done and let's be certain about it. Well, you can be certain that you're destroying the economic capacity of the state, that you're driving people and businesses from the state or from even considering the state. That seems to me the only thing that we get in terms of the certainty from Chicago Democrats who've been in charge of the General Assembly for the last 4 or 5 generations.
Yeah. Well, so I have a chart that I look at, and it shows what our increase in spending has been since 1995 until now. And so in 1995, there was about $15 billion, which you put that in today's dollars, we calculated a little bit ago, it's about $25 billion. Now we're on track to spend somewhere between $38 billion and $40. I mean, this is a nearly 50% increase in the last 20 years in the size and scope of government. And so we go back, and right now we're slated to spend about $6 billion more this fiscal year than we have coming in. And so we're talking an increase of nearly $15 billion over the last 20 plus years. We're spending $6 billion more than we have coming in, and we can't cut spending in any meaningful way to get to a balanced budget.
Well, the other thing about that too is the spend. I mean, I think you would be hard pressed to find an Illinoisan or an Illinois family that says, yeah, we've increased spending that much, but I feel like I'm getting 50% more government in terms of improving my life, access to services, quality of life, or even just the annual increment. I feel like things are really on the uptick, that I have confidence in my government. And I'm talking about even those people that are on the lower ends of the socioeconomic spectrum that rely on government services. You don't hear families with a family member that has a developmental disability, for example, saying, boy, you know, that increased spend, I know it hurts some people that are struggling to get by, but I really feel it in terms of improved services for my family member. Nobody says that. I really feel it in terms of increased access to quality health care. Nobody says that. This is all kind of input driven with editorial boards as the amplifier for Chicago Democrats. But try and find an Illinoisan or an Illinois family that says that I'm deriving a demonstrable benefit from the increased spend.
Well, you know, I've talked to people who've actually went out and bought an SUV, even if it's a small size SUV, because the potholes in the road, because they don't trust the government to even take care of our roads in such a fashion that they feel like they can drive a regular car and not have to worry about getting a flat tire or you know, damaging their transmission by just driving to and from work.
Well, let's just take a step back, because you're a freshman, you've been there not even 2 years.
Right.
And so, but you were involved in the legislative process. You're politically savvy prior to running for office and being elected state senator. You know, give us a sense of what you thought things would be like going into the state senate, and what they turned out to be, what the beta is there.
Well, first of all, you know, I did some work in other states. I had people who, you know, would do some advocacy-related work, nonprofit work I did before, and what I would say in other states was that. You know, we essentially operate like a full-time legislature, but there's very few full-time legislatures out there. And sometimes people will argue that the big state, or the fifth largest state in the country, must have bigger problems, thus you need more time. And that's simply not the case. Florida, 60 calendar days, hard stop, that's it. They go home, do their business. You know?
How about Texas, that meets once every 2 years?
Right, yeah.
And they get a stipend.
Yeah. Exactly.
The legislators.
Virginia meets 60 days one year, 45 days the next, and you know they're right outside of D.C. and have a lot of issues that are going on there. So that is simply not the case. The fact that we meet 5 months every year and then have to come back for special session or veto session and things like that, it's not because we have such big problems and we're really working hard to take care of them. It's simply the kind of culture. I mean, we're the fifth highest paid state legislature in the country, and yet we have this to show for it. 2 years with no regular budget, year upon year of overspending. And so when I went down to Springfield, and one of the things that I was curious to see was really how much people down there saw this as a vocation, saw this as something that they were giving back to their community, right? And
I feel a punchline coming on.
You know, it's fascinating, but you generally don't see that down there. I mean, there are legislators down there on both sides of the aisle that I would say have their community's heart and mind, and they're working, you know, to try to represent their community well. There are some who are as far left as I think can possibly be, and they genuinely care about their community and want to do the state good. We disagree on how we get there. But there are people down there who are simply doing this because it's a good pension. They get health care. If they're in for 8 years, they get health care for life. You know, it's a good salary for the amount of time that they have to be down there. And then often they'll do
and the
other
amount
things
of
on the
thinking
side.
they have to do while they're down there, since they're
certainly.
roll call votes for leadership.
Sure, yeah. I mean, yeah. After that, you know, your vast majority of votes are structured. You know, virtually nothing comes to the House floor, for example. And even the Senate floor for that matter, without a structured roll call to know who's going to be voting for this, so that we let certain people off who this might be a problem in their district, and if you're in a safe district, then you're going to, you know, embrace this. But there are a number of people who do this simply because they're in it for themselves. And some of them who then also run some sort of side operation, side business that they do, whether it be consulting or
side hustle,
lawyer.
I think is the term.
Well, I mean, you know, the speaker himself obviously has a side business that he makes a lot of money at, and he has said publicly that on a good year he makes 7 figures, and he's never said how many bad years he's had,
Yeah.
but my guess is there aren't that many.
Yeah. But so, I mean, you know, the whole good intentions thing, didn't Samuel Johnson say something about the road to hell being paved with those good intentions? At some point, do we start to hold people accountable and also use the bully pulpit that you have as a legislator and as a caucus to say, you know, the good intentions of my colleagues, whether in my caucus or on the other side, that's nice, and I'll take them at their word. I don't know what's in a man or a woman's heart, so I'll take them at their word. It doesn't matter. What matters is the results they provide for their constituents and for this state. And the results are abysmal. So can we dispense with the conversation about everybody's good intentions and how public-oriented they are, and focus on the inputs they extract and the outputs they produce?
Well, to that point, and to the question you asked before, kind of what was the biggest surprise I had. I'd only been in the legislature for 2 or 3 weeks, and there was kind of a lull on the floor, and we'd been given a rule book, for the Senate, and I started going through the rules.
With the key to the executive washroom, I presume.
So I'm going through the rules, and I'm looking at them, and I just realize how autocratic the legislature is down there. For example, and this will be in the weeds for a lot of people, but for those kind of political geeks, it's interesting. In most states, you have the ability. So if I introduce a bill, I'm the chief sponsor. You'll have chief co-sponsors. We allow up to 4 chief co-sponsors. And then there's an unlimited number of co-sponsors after that, right? Well, in most states, when you have a co-sponsor, that is that actually is somebody who has some degree of power and authority. So let's say your bill, you draft a bill, and you can't get it out of the Rules Committee or out of the Assignments Committee and sent to a committee to actually be debated. Well, if you get 5 or 7 co-sponsors on your bill, well, that bill automatically gets kicked out of assignments or rules and then put in the appropriate committee and has to have a hearing. If your bill is bottled up in committee, I've had some bills that have been, we passed the Senate unanimously, and then we had somebody who was connected to a special interest in the House that got signed to their committee, and they just bottled it up. For example, there's a bill I introduced that would put on everybody's property tax bill a very clear indication if there's an abatement. So if a local government unit of government says, I don't need to take all the money I could, I'm going to give some money back to you, then they would, it shows up on the tax bill. And the goal of this was to try to get some competition really between local units of government.
Competition so providing property tax relief rather than
exactly.
property tax imposition.
So that way, right. So if your township is giving, they could take $300 and they're giving you $100 back, and then, but your town isn't doing that, or your park district isn't doing that, you can go to them and say, hey, the township can do it, why can't you guys do it? Right? Put it right on the property tax bill.
Okay.
So we pass it out of the Senate unanimously. It goes over into the to the House and gets put in committee, and the chairman won't even bring it up for a hearing.
Which is why it was passed unanimously in the Senate.
Probably
because they knew it was going to be killed in the House.
So, there's other rules in the state, for example, something called a discharge petition. So if I go around and if I get more than 50% of the chamber to sign on to a discharge petition for my bill, that bill gets kicked out of the committee, comes to the floor, and it has to have an up or down debate and up or down votes. We don't have any of those type of rules. We have virtually no rules that enable individual members to be able to have any kind of control over the process or even the ability of being able to have something heard. And that, I think, has probably been the most disappointing. And my understanding is that, after, there's a 2-year hiatus in which the speaker was not in the House, in which the speaker was not speaker. Republicans rewrote the rules, made them much more autocratic, and when the speaker came back, he says, hey, I like these.
Sure.
My understanding, Pate Phillip, the Republican in the Senate, did the same thing to Democrats when he came in, and then after he left, the Democrats were like, well, okay, we're going to put it back at you. So this is something that's, the lack of democracy, even within the legislature, is something both parties have been party to for a very long time.
The lack of democracy in our representative republic, or for shorthand, our democracy. Part of the problem in Illinois. Well, the one thing that legislators can do is be incubators of ideas.
Sure.
You can use your bully pulpit, as I suggested. You can propose ideas. You can do even what you and a colleague of yours, State Senator Kyle McCarter from Southern Illinois, did, which is to propose your own balanced state budget without increasing taxes, giving lie to those detractors in both parties that say that can't be done. There is no pathway for a constitutionally balanced state budget that does not increase the tax burden on Illinois families. You produced a budget that does just that.
Yeah, we did. We called it the taxpayer bargain. And so what it did, just in shorthand, is it cut all state agencies 10% across the board. We left untouched Medicaid, education, debt services, and pensions. We cut universities by 5% of overall budget, and then we cut local governments by 4% of overall budget. And that would get us almost within range of having a balanced budget. You got to do some little tweaks around the edges of kind of specific things here and there. But that got you really close to what it is. Now, let me be the first to say that is it is a hard thing to do. I mean, if you're going to be trying to cut $6 billion out of the budget, there's going to be pain that goes around.
Yeah, but just a stop there for a second. And this is without addressing public sector pensions, largest unfunded public sector pension liability in the country, without addressing Medicaid, which is a budget buster that we don't finance, and because we continue to expand eligibility without financing the obligations, actually those who originally intended to be served by Medicaid see their access to quality health care worsen. Didn't touch those, which I think is problematic, but we'll get there in a second. But even still, this is not easy to do. This is difficult. 5% cut in higher ed funding. 4% cut in funding
the overall budget.
The LDGB.
Local Government Distribution Fund. Yeah, sorry, the acronyms. It's like military. But anyway, 5% cut, 4% cut. Hey, that's not easy to do. This is draconian. This is apocalyptic. I think most people hear that, a 5% cut here and a 4% cut here, and even a 10% across the board cut, and they say, yeah, I understand belt tightening in difficult times. Sure, yeah.
I mean, and oh, by the way, when you include the kind of predicate state of affairs, for example, higher ed, and I've made this point many times on this show, Illinois subsidizes the highest in-state tuition for Illinois State universities and colleges with respect to their conference peers in the Midwest.
Well, let me explain why I said this is going to be hard. And part of the reason why it's going to be hard is we did not get rid of prevailing wage, requirements. We did not, because we were looking at a budget. We were looking at how do we balance a budget. So we did not address kind of the union stranglehold that really does exist on state governments, many municipalities, road construction, things like that. So we didn't address some of the unfunded mandates, that get handed down by, we addressed some of them, but in total, we didn't address all of those types of things. So when you're looking, it'll be difficult. Why? Because the state continues to so constrict the way either local governments or universities or education in general can do business that it would be difficult to be able to do that, right? So this would entail cutting positions. It entails, curtailing services.
So the regulatory framework combined with the tax and spend framework.
Right, yeah, exactly. Because we looked at it as a budget, right? And that's what we were trying to do. Now, this is something that the governor has been criticized for. Speaker Madigan criticized him in the last week for the fact that he was trying to take non-budgetary stuff, whether it be prevailing wage, whether it be right to work, whether it be, some of the procurement reform and things like this that the governor was trying to do, and make it a part of the budget debate. And he's saying, well, we should just balance the budget. So what we did was we went out there and said, okay, it's possible to balance the budget without doing this other stuff. It'll be painful because the governor is right. We do need structural reform in the state that the Democrats have been unwilling to consider.
And he's also right that the regulatory framework imposes costs.
Exactly.
So that by definition makes it a budgetary item. I mean, that's the kind of the Orwellian speak about what is a budgetary or non-budgetary item, like a mandate on you shall perform or you shall not perform. That doesn't change your cost structure if you're a business or a social service provider or a public institution. That's absurd.
Right.
Nobody believes that. Other than Chicago Democrats.
Well, and I don't even know that I don't even know that I would say they don't believe that. What I would say is it goes back to the end of the day to the statement that members of the Democratic Party leadership have said, which is we can't touch the unions and we can't touch trial lawyers. We can't do tort reform. We can't touch prevailing wage. We can't touch these things because those benefactors who keep us in power have said, this is off limits.
So if you have enough sacred cows, then you just kind of run out of areas where there's latitude, right, in terms of budgeting.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's essentially it. But on that point, now again, I know your horizon was a fiscal year constitutionally balanced budget. So you're not trying to solve all of Illinois' problems in one document, which is a Herculean task. I get it. Sisyphean task is probably a better description. but I mean, can Illinois get back to long-term financial stability and be an attractive state to drop anchor as a family or as a entrepreneurial capitalist if you don't address some of these budget busting items like public sector pensions, like Medicaid?
Sure. Well, you're going to have to. That long term, you're going to have structural reforms. I mean, the governor is exactly right about that. There has been a proposal to even to have a constitutional convention, in part because of these budget busting problems. It's been actually, 50 years at this point?
70.
Well, since the last constitutional convention which was in 1968, 69,
right.
For the 1970 Constitution. And so there's been discussion that started now about, okay, maybe we have to have that, actually have to have that conversation. In part, the unions did bake in some really great stuff, great protections. The pension protections was one of those. In the Supreme Court, on a 4-3, vote margin before, has sided and said, you can't touch these things. You can't do these things, depending on what issue it is that you're looking at. So that, I do think that having to go back and look at the Constitution and what are going to be the guarantees there is going to have to be a part of the solution at some point.
I think it's fair to look at Madigan's 40-year reign of terror over Illinois and say, boy, it's interesting that the individual who everyone concedes is the most powerful politician in the state, governors come and go and Madigan stays, what has happened during his 4 decades. However, in addition to that, isn't it also fair to say, why aren't Republicans doing a better job making arguments other than, Madigan is the devil incarnate, Madigan is responsible for this, and Madigan is responsible for that? I agree, accountability starts at the top of the power structure. But for example, in the issue of higher ed, where are Republicans to say, close down Chicago State?
Sure.
Where are Republicans to say, Northeast Illinois University is crying poor? $108,000 per college graduate over the last couple of graduating classes. You got 4 employees for every student at Northeast Illinois University. Where are Republicans saying these institutions that are crying poor, rather than being put back on our hind legs, and I say are because I'm self-identified conservative, put back on our hind legs about these institutions, saying we provide you, I'm just using this as an example, Northeast Illinois, $40 million a year. And what do we get in return? $108,000 of spend per college graduate. That is not a good return on our investment. There is something structurally deformed about how you operate your institution of higher learning that has to change internally for us to give you a red cent more. You don't hear that from Republicans. They don't want to take on the institutions where it's easy for Democrats to say, what are you against college education? Mm-hmm. What are you against K through 12 education? What are you against social service providers? We're not against any of those things. We're against those institutions not providing what they promised to provide to Illinois families.
Well, and this was the unfortunate thing. I asked I was on the appropriations committee, so I asked, on this particular topic, I asked each of the universities who would come up, I would say, is there an overall plan for state support of universities in the state and for your school, that how you fit into that? And over again, I was just told no. How is it that we're spending as much money as we are? And even the head of the State Board of Education, the State Board of Higher Education says, oh yeah, there's no plan. We don't have a plan.
Entitlement mentality.
Right. So and this is part of it where, well, this is just what we do. This is what we've always done. This is other states support higher education. Well, we support higher education. There hasn't really been the deep dive that is necessary. I consider myself a data-driven elected official. I try to approach it just based, where's the data going to take me? I want to get to a good result.
By the way, provide value for your constituents. You're in a district where the overwhelming majority of families are looking for their kids to graduate from college and go on to be successful independent adults. And so if I send my kid to a state college or university, am I getting the best return for a substantial investment I'm making to send my kid to NEIU, to U of I, to Illinois State, to wherever?
Well, and we have the same issue with K-12 education.
Yeah.
There was an effort put through. I was a part of to try to look at how do we change school funding, the way in which school funding is distributed in the state. And unfortunately, during the last few days of the session, the whole process was bastardized, and Senate Democrats took and recreated a package that then, along with House Democrats, to give a massive bailout to Chicago public schools and essentially stick everybody else in the state, including some of the poorest people across the state, where they would get, there was some poor school districts, very high concentrations of poverty, $31 per student, whereas CPS is getting $1,333 per student. That is, the fact that they were willing to stick it to other poor kids across the state simply to prop up the failing school system that's here just goes to show why, Chicago is a part of the state. I understand that, but they get at times a disproportionate support of taxpayer dollars from across the state, and it is something that not just hurts families but hurts children.
Well, it's not at times, it's always. And I mean, your point is one that Republicans should make more often. Why should Matson or Fort Heights subsidize Chicago? What kind of sense does that make? This isn't about, leafy Barrington or the North Shore or the Western Burbs, Hinsdale kind of supporting Chicago. This is about other poor, largely minority communities supporting Chicago, having their limited dollars extracted and funneled into this failing school system called CPS.
And then you have Chicago that doesn't even tax itself at the rate in which they could. Their tax rates are artificially low. Their property tax rates are artificially low.
Subsidized by commercial.
But even then, fully half of the city of Chicago is in a TIF district. And so the tax increment financing district, those monies are not accessible. They don't count toward the available EAV. They're not accessible to be taxed for the schools. And yet, what does Rahm Emanuel do at the last negotiation with public sector unions? He takes money out of the TIFs, puts them into the school system. So he takes off-limits money, puts it into them in order to help take care of their whims and wishes. And yet they're going and crying poor to the state because, this is only the EAV that's available, and they leave half of it off. So they're gaming the system in order to get more state funding than they deserve or ever should get.
So going back to the budget document that you and Senator McCarter produced, this is, basically you put a marker down and say, okay,
Yep.
Here is a constitutionally balanced budget that does not increase taxes. You don't like it or you don't like aspects of it? Fine, let's discuss it.
Yeah, let's rearrange these chairs.
So what was the feedback from your colleagues in the House and the Senate?
So those who are conservatives were like, hey, somebody stood up and actually put forward a budget, thank God. Representative Batnick introduced the same bills in the House.
Republican from Plainfield in the House.
Right, yeah. We had some feedback from some Democrats on the other side, some of whom just said, well, your cuts are just too draconian, we could never do that. But there was actually a small group of Democrats who said, I don't want to raise taxes. I don't want to do this. We would rather sign on to your budget. But they were not going to stick their head out publicly. They were not going to cross Madigan. If Madigan wasn't going to entertain significant cuts, well, they weren't going to kind of step forward and say, well, I'm going to be somebody who can be out there in public on this.
So all those public service-oriented Democrats who are there to do the bidding of their constituents were unwilling to risk their political careers to do what they thought was right. I mean, is that a fair statement?
I would not disagree with you.
And so your proposed constitutionally balanced budget just became another document to be shelved by the political class in Springfield, effectively, right?
Effectively,
because
yeah.
that's why we're here in June, with no budget.
Mm-hmm.
And the Democrats' big idea, the best they could muster, was a roll call vote on a $5 billion tax increase in the Senate with nothing on the spending side.
Very little. Yeah,
So
small stuff here and there.
What did your budget do on the spending side such that you at least put reins on the beast, if not starve it, going forward?
Well, so what we would have done is just gone into all the different departments and said, You've got to figure it out. And we would have given the governor broader authority to be able to rein in the spending, to reorganize, restructure the departments as he thought it was kind of most advantageous to do that. And this would have strengthened his hand in being able to hopefully streamline these departments and actually get them much, functioning in a better, more efficient fashion. Part of the struggle that the governor, I think, has had has just been the fact that the Democrats have routinely tied the hands of the governor at times when he's tried to make substantive changes. So, for example, he was trying to privatize certain aspects of medical services in Department of Corrections. And so what do the Democrats do? They start passing legislation to prohibit, to create a floor that that the prison system has to have at least this many nurses, regardless of what the prison size was. So if in the next 10 years our prison population dumps in half, we would still, by law, have to have so many nurses on board.
Maintain the status quo by law.
Yeah, exactly. And while we're going through all of this crisis at this point in time, what did the Democrats do over the past 5 months but pass legislation? We passed legislation through the Senate, nearly $2 billion in new spending. Various new programs.
It's incredible.
And things. Yeah.
I mean, they talked about the legislature. Was it Kelly Cassidy? Public financing of political campaigns.
Yeah, we passed that one.
We have $14 billion in unpaid bills to social service providers and state vendors. And Kelly Cassidy, a Chicago Democrat state rep, wants
Dan Biss
wants the government to wants the government, meaning Illinois families, to finance politicians' campaigns.
Well, this was in the Senate.
This is how incorrigible they are.
So this is in the Senate when we had the debate on the floor. It was carried by Senator Dan Biss, who's running for governor, and who's a Bernie Sanders kind of supporter. And he wanted to make all small contributions matched by taxpayer dollars. Initially, he did it as a continuing appropriation, which means there was no limits whatsoever. There was no cap. So, and what we were saying, wait a minute, we can't fund rape crisis centers. We can't fund, the mentally handicapped who can't get their services. And yet we're going to put an unlimited, no cap and an ongoing appropriation, money to be able to pay for sleazy campaign ads, as we all have seen and hate during the campaign cycle. The mailers that come in, we're going to use taxpayer dollars to support that.
And Will Guzzardi, another Bernie Sanders progressive in the Democrat caucus in the House, left-winger in the city of Chicago, what did he propose? A new scholarship fund. Scholarship fund for persons that are here illegally, right? Mm-hmm. For access to higher ed. So now you're saying, hey, Ma and Dad in your district up in Lake County, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to charge you the highest local and state tax burden in the country. And then we're going to use that to subsidize the highest in-state tuition for state colleges and universities in the country, so we get you on both sides. And then on top of that, here's the kicker. We're going to take some of the money that we extract from you, and we're going to use it for scholarships, not for your kids, but for persons in this country and in Illinois, by extension, illegally. Raise your hand, and what do the Democrats do? Raise their hands.
529 programs, the college scholarship funds. I have one. I put help put money in it for my kids. We passed a bill out of the Senate that would have established a brand new college scholarship fund for every child in the state, and then given them $50 to start it off with, of taxpayer money. Now, if you didn't have to put another dime into it. If you wanted to at some point and said, well, that's my $50, I want the check, you could have requested from the treasurer's office a $50 check. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that we've had to deal with.
We are de Tocqueville's example of a democratic republic, small d, that destroys itself by ever engaging in the bribing of people with their own money, creating an entitlement mentality among the populace writ large, such that it's just a feeding frenzy among families for other people's money. And the justification is, well, wait a second, they took from me, so now I'm just trying to take a slice back. And they put people in this vicious circle, and what's ultimately center to everyone's lives? Government. Mm-hmm. Everyone lives and dies by government. And if everyone lives and dies by government, who's the beneficiary? the purveyors of big government.
No,
That's isn't that the political paradox of it all?
Yeah, and the unfortunate thing is that there's been no penalty really that has been paid.
Not electorally.
Right. Yeah, exactly. No penalty that's been paid. And those people who have tried to stand up on the other side of the aisle and say no, you had Scott Drury just he said I can't vote for Madigan for Speaker. He pulls a primary opponent.
Democrat state rep from Lake Forest.
Right. And pulls a primary opponent already. A year and a half before the election. And you've had others who've stood up in the past, and they're primaried, and millions of dollars are put behind them and taken out.
So what's the message? I mean, kind of stripping away the process and the politics, which people listening to this are going to be like, oh, good grief. I mean, I'm glad I'm planning my exit strategy from Illinois, which everyone is now doing, who has the wherewithal to rent a U-Haul truck. Right? Where am I going to be in 5 years when the kids are out of school or I'm retired? Mm-hmm. And I don't say that glibly. I think that's a sad commentary in Illinois. It's the saddest commentary. People looking to flee, looking for their exit. But what's the message to them when it pertains to social service providers, quality of K-12, quality of higher ed, access to economic opportunity? And not just economic opportunity in terms of a job, but in terms of a path to a career, right? This isn't about jobs, it's about careers. It's about building a life for yourself in this state. What is the message to them amid all of this wrangling between politicians in Springfield about what they should be considering, what they should be doing? When you hear people, as I'm sure you do, when you talk to your constituents saying, Dan, I appreciate what you're doing, but we are out of here in 2 years, 4 years, 5 years. What do you say to them?
Well, I say that there's actually, I see hope on the horizon. I mean, if you went back maybe even 5, 6 years, the number of strong fiscal conservatives who stood up and planted the flag in Springfield, rallied around it on a continuous basis, were few and far between. That isn't the case anymore. I mean, there is a growing bevy of those of us in both the House and the Senate who are willing to stand up and have said, we mentioned Mark Batnick earlier, he took a stand earlier this year of saying, I am not going to vote on anything that doesn't have to do with the budget. He got all this kind of crazy stuff that was coming up.
Yeah.
And he said, you know what, if that ends up, if my taking a stand on this means I don't get re-elected office, so be it. But I'm going to stand up and I'm going to do what's right. And there's a growing number of those of us down there who are not looking at this as a career. We've turned down the pensions. We don't take the health care. We are just interested in how do we save our state. And that group is growing to the size that we're starting to have to be reckoned with, right? Both within our caucus as well as on the other side of the aisle. And there are people who, I've talked to some members on the other side of the aisle who said, in the short time that you've been down here, you've developed a reputation of a thoughtful person who cares about the data, who cares about the people. And that is something that isn't overlooked. It's something that other people notice. And that, I think, is a hopeful sign. And the governor, who has been a real cheerleader for fiscal responsibility, has I think, really helped to give a greater voice to those of us who have been making this argument, whether on the inside or the outside, for a while now.
And I appreciate that, and I appreciate leadership by consensus, leadership by example, or leadership by example that builds consensus, I guess is a better way to say it. But what do you say to the family in your district, or again, across the state, that says, it's great that you're not taking the pension, that you're not accessing the health care, that you're not looking at this as a career, but that doesn't do much for me as I'm trying to manage my household, particularly as it pertains to property taxes, which is property taxes destroying home equity in this state. People don't really own their homes in Illinois with the highest property taxes in the nation. They're basically their homes, my home, your home, collateral for somebody else's public sector pension. And they hear politicians say, I support a freeze. Well, I pay the highest property tax of the nation. My property taxes have doubled in the last decade in real terms. A freeze at this level doesn't do me much good because I can't manage this level in perpetuity. I want relief. What about on that score with the largest investment that most people make, and this is kind of my issue of particular focus on the fiscal stability side, what do you say to people to say we should reduce property taxes to essentially validate people's largest investment, protect it to make sure they have a return on it, to make sure that they're incented to stay in Illinois because they have an expected return on their home value when they decide to downsize or whatever. I've proposed a hard cap, Indiana style, 1% of property tax value, 1% property tax as a percentage of home value, I should say. And that's been met with varying responses. But it seems to me there's a real clamoring out in the hustings for real relief because people are starting to understand that their homes are being taken by the government out from underneath them.
Right. Well, and I agree in that a freeze is nice, rhetoric, but it is simply not going to solve the problem. This is part of what we were looking at. Generally somewhere between 60 and 90% of somebody's property tax bill is education. It's because we actually disproportionately fund education at the local level.
Right.
And it's, the big problem with property taxes is it's based on the perceived value. It's a carrying cost of your land, right? It's not based on your economic activity at all.
And it's also not based on the market value of your home.
In many cases, that's right. And so this is why we need to fundamentally move away from property tax as the primary funder of education, and then do what we can do as far as government consolidation in addressing these other issues that we keep coming back to, whether it's that keep the cost of government high, prevailing wage, and these other types of things. It's all of those factors working together that contribute to this property tax. Now, some people want to advocate for simply let's cap it, and this gives an opportunity for the local units of government to kind of get things under control. I actually favor a cap of some sort that is significantly below, whether it's 1% or what is it, that you actually put a maximum on how much you can have as a property tax, move that education funding over, and then you come up with other ways in which to fund local government operations.
Maximum dollar amount?
Maximum, well, as far as the value of the home. So a percentage, a cap on a rate.
Cap on the levy.
Right, yeah. And so by doing this, you can actually, for example, this is a real boon for businesses in some of the poorest parts of our state, right? So some of the poorest parts of our state have the highest property taxes because this is the way in which they fund the schools, right? And so you mentioned Ford Heights earlier. I think they have, something like a 14% property tax rate. I mean, astronomical
As a
amount.
percentage of home value. The highest in Cook County, 99% African American, one of the poorest communities in the country. It's criminal. I mean, Laura Washington, who, oh, by the way, not a conservative, columnist for the Sun-Times, she raised this issue recently in an op-ed that she penned, and it's, I think, without her saying it, and she's a friend, but without her saying it, it's largely based on the research that we've done in the newspapers I started that just lay out the facts. I mean, you've essentially foreclosed the opportunity for home ownership in many of these communities and neighborhoods in Chicago.
Right, and a business is not going to move into that community and start up an operation, right? Because if you have a warehouse and you're paying an annual property tax, regardless of whether or not you make profit, well, you've got to build that into the cost of doing business, right? Whereas if you move away from property taxes to other forms of taxation that's actually based on your economic activity, you can go out and start a new business. Well, when you start that business, you're not making money for a while, you're not paying tax. And when you're suddenly making money, then you're paying the tax on that. It actually benefits new businesses, benefits entrepreneurship.
Well, right. And oh, by the way, Fort Heights is not a Caribbean island. Fort Heights is right next to Indiana, right next to Will County. So all you have to do if you're a business owner or, frankly, somebody that's interested in home ownership in that region is to say, well, what's the cost to live across the border in Indiana? What's the cost to live across the border in Will County but stay in the state of Illinois?
Well, so there was a Flossmoor, right, another community right down in that area. A commercial real estate broker sent me 2 listings, one of which was for a house that was advertised at $79,000. It sold for $70,000. The property tax bill on that was like $7,000 a year.
I mean,
okay,
it's
the other
10%
listing
of property value.
Right. The other listing was for a commercial 4-suite unit that was advertised at, I think it was $450,000, $459,000. Annual property tax bill was $53,900 a year. I mean, who can survive on that, right? If you're going to buy a building and your property tax alone is more than 50 grand, it's just not.
Two-thirds of property value, two-thirds of purchase price. And so who's going to, no one is going to do that, which is why the Southland, just to use this as an example, that speaks to the larger problem, is a demilitarized zone. You've destroyed opportunity for millions and millions of families over the course of the decades in which this system has been in place. And again, no accountability. And this, to me, seems like we should be screaming at this from the rooftops, not just because it's obscene and in spite of the fact that these are not areas that vote Republican, because it's wrong. It's morally wrong. And especially somebody that I think comes to politics from a moral perspective. Where are the moral arguments that are being made by conservatives and Republicans on issues of fiscal responsibility? These are moral matters.
Absolutely,
when you take somebody's property, when you take their lifetime investments, when you take their opportunities away from them, that is a moral question, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, if you're going to borrow money that you don't plan to pay back, but you're going to pass it off to the next generation, that's generational theft.
Which is what politicians are doing.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the fact that in the last 2 years we've now grown our unfunded bills alone to over $14 billion a year. We only have 12.3 million people in this state. You know, we're down to talking like $1,100 or so per man, woman, and child in the state, just simply to pay the bills on the comptroller's desk. Like $1,100 per person. That's just to pay that. That doesn't count for the unfunded liabilities. Unfunded pension liabilities now stand at $130 billion. This is over $10,000 per man, woman, and child in the state, right? And we're not at all talking about current expenditures, right? We're not talking about the debts that we currently have, what we've bonded out. We aren't talking about any of those things right now.
And so, you know, particularly your district with communities like Mettawa and Barrington Hills that are largely populated by horses, if we're not going to tax them at confiscatory rates, what is the path forward to move Illinois back from the precipice, to restore something resembling adult leadership in this state?
Well, the first thing you have to do is just to say, I'm sorry to the unions and the trial lawyers and the special interests who have had such a stranglehold on the state, and say, we could continue to giving you the handouts that we've been giving you, but then this entire state is just going to go under. And so we got to say sorry. I mean, you guys need to grow up and as well. I mean, that type of clarity, moral clarity, needs to be communicated to those special interests. My assumption is that they aren't going to care, and they're going to continue to fund people who are interested in just simply giving the handouts back to them. But at some point, you know, you can't get blood out of a turnip, right? And we are very close to being a turnip.
And so the political question that's concurrent with that question about how do we get our way back policy-wise, how does the Republican Party go from super minority in the Senate, where you are, minority in the House, the governor get reelected? Because it seems to me it's not like a good idea problem. There's a dearth of good ideas. It's a political will problem. So if it's a political will problem, you either need to persuade the other side to do what you suggest they instinctively want to do but are afraid to do politically, or you need to change them out so you have a different distribution of political power. So thinking about the 2018 election, which is not so far away, 16 months away, what would you suggest is the message for Republicans to the Illinois electorate that hasn't embraced them, such as they find themselves in the General Assembly?
Well, I think what you do is you have to lay out a vision. Here is where we would go as a state under fiscally conservative control. We would actually have property tax. We would actually have the the kind of reforms necessary to be able to provide property tax relief. Let's get away from this freeze idea. Let's go to property tax relief, lowering of property taxes. Let's talk about consolidation of units of government. Let's talk about the fundamental reforms that actually stop protecting the special interests and actually drop the price. Because, you know, the important thing for a lot of people to realize is that the public sector unions that have controlled the state for so long, you know, in a private business, you have the union and the ownership, and it's a competition over profit, right? Who is going to get the profit that's coming out of this business? Well, in this case, you have public sector unions, and who are they stand against? The public, and it's the money that's in the public's pocket, which through the coercive power of taxation, through just the ability of law, you can use a vacuum to that and just continue to suck it out, right? And that is why I think people need to get to the point that they understand that the status quo that has existed in the state. Why are people moving to the other states around us? It's because they've done these types of reforms. It's because they've put the unions in check. It's because they've actually gone back to market principles that put the taxpayer and the public sector worker back on the appropriate footing, the even footing that they ought to be.
Let me run this by you. Here's what I think Senate Democrats did when they passed that $5.5 billion tax increase that we talked about, the 32% increase in the state income tax and all the rest of it. They basically said to Illinois families, you know what? You know what the problem with this, Illinois? You're the problem. You're not paying enough. Mm-hmm. You failed us, the political class, right? Because we need to take more of what you earn in order to establish a foundation, in order to pass a balanced state budget for the first time in 3 decades. You're the problem. And it seems to me that the Republican Party's opportunity is to say, here is and I understand the need to work across the aisle and all that stuff, but at some point you can only provide so much political cover to cowardice. This is what they're saying. You're the problem. And what I'm saying, Senator McConchie, Governor Ronner, whoever, is no, you're not the problem. The problem is people who think that you are an endless source of of resources for them to distribute to their political constituencies that you've been describing during the course of this interview. And I will take everything that you have in order to feather bed my political constituencies to maintain my political power. And that's really the choice that you have. Are you going to allow your home to be taken? Are you going to allow them to forever be extracting what you earn and blaming you all along the way? Or are you going to chart a different course that kind of re-empowers you by reimagining what you should retain as a percentage of your earnings so that you can make your way in this state? Mm-hmm. To me, that's the idea of what they're saying by the policy choices they make. I don't think we translate that enough. I think we get too much involved in the political machinations and the process and the inside the bubble back and forth. But,
sure.
But isn't that what Democrats are saying when they say a 32% increase in your personal income tax income? Aren't they saying, Illinois families, you failed us. That's why we need to take more from you. If you're taking more from somebody, aren't you saying they're responsible?
Well, you know, I've had some people who have contacted me, whether via Facebook or what have you, and they've said, you know, I'm the bad guy because I'm unwilling to actually, you know, provide the appropriate public services in whatever the circumstance
Right.
is. To which my response has been, you know, you are free to write a larger check to the state if you don't feel
They
like
will
you were
accept
taxed
it.
enough. All you have to do is send the check. You write it to the Illinois Department of Revenue, send it over, and they will cash it. And for some reason, I haven't had anyone yet take up my suggestion that they assist the state in this manner.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. We have this terrible suspension of disbelief problem in the state. On the one hand, you have people who are invested in this government-centric worldview say exactly what you said, some of your constituents have said to you. You're not making the tough decisions to fund these services. On the other hand, those same people are saying to you, I don't want to see my property taxes, income taxes, sales taxes, cable TV taxes, cloud taxes, water taxes, et cetera, increase. Because you know what? Even if I believe, and even if I could shoulder the burden to pay a little bit more to the state,
I don't trust it to be spent right.
bingo.
Yeah.
And this is why
That's
so many
absolutely the
people
case.
have left who are of a center-left perspective to say, hey, look, I'm all for fully funding K through 12. I'm all for rethinking how we fund social services to make sure people who need state services through no fault of their own get those services. But I don't trust you guys in charge to translate my money to the benefit of people I want to see benefited. So why would I be on board to send more of my money to you?
Yeah.
And isn't that the greatest indictment? But I don't, again, it's one of those things where the quality of the argumentation matters. And I don't see enough Republicans making the argument to really sort of jar people into a dot-connected moment where they say, well, wait a second, yeah, that is actually what I'm thinking. I want social services funded. I want people with disabilities served. I want kids given the resources they need to access a quality education at the K through 12 level. But I don't trust any of the people in charge of any of those institutions to do anything I want them to do.
Yeah. No, it's absolutely the case.
And so now thinking about where we are today and with the 2018 horizon, I mean, are we going to November of 2018 before anything that we've discussed here over the last hour is materially addressed? Or do you hold out a flicker of hope that something could be, some deal could be made in the interim that at least provides interim stability for one fiscal year between now and then?
Well, I think the big question comes down to school funding, because there are many schools across the state that if there is no budget, if there's no appropriation for schools, will simply not open. And some of these are in very dangerous areas of the state. And so the question, in some respects, schools being open is important for our murder rate to go down in the fall, right? I mean, this keeps kids out of the line of fire between gangs and what have you. And that is, I think, probably the number one issue. People are going to want their kids to go back to school. And this is, I think, the kind of one remaining lever that's really left. We shouldn't be paying state employees right now, right? But we are paying them under court order, but without a budget, we probably shouldn't be paying them at all. If we weren't paying state employees, if the DMV wasn't open and so forth, we would have had a budget already. The other issue has been schools. Schools the last 2 years have been taken off of the table. The first time the governor line item vetoed the entire budget except for schools, so schools could open. Last year it was this stopgap budget, which funded everything but for 6 months except schools and roads and bridges. That was done for a full year. This is again going to be that lever, and there's going to have to become, the governor has said he's not going to sign a stopgap budget even for schools unless it included term limits and a property tax freeze. And the Democrats have said no way to that. So I think that is where we're really at loggerheads this summer, and I don't know how late this is going to go. But that I think is going to be the key issue, where I think people have the best opportunity left to really wake up and look at what's going on around them.
That inflection point.
That has them say, oh wait, all right, this can't go on further.
Well, we shall see. He is State Senator Dan McConchie, not just a representative of the Republican Party, representing Lake County primarily, lives in Hawthorne Woods, but also representing a new generation of leadership for the state of Illinois. State Senator Dan McConchie, thanks so much for joining us on Against the Current. Appreciate it.
Thanks for being on, Dan.